For our COBT viewers and listeners, it's Maynard, Mike, and Jeff here with something super special that we've been working on for a while. Over the last year or so, we have been getting to know Saronic Technologies. They make autonomous surface vehicles, which is another way of saying autonomous boats. And you have got to hear everything they are up to. They're based in Austin, Texas. They have multiple offices around the country. They recently raised money at a $9+ billion valuation led by Kleiner Perkins. So this is at the cutting edge of military technology, of reindustrializing America, of bringing back shipbuilding, and of modern warfare. We're particularly lucky to have Doug Lambert. He's the co-founder and COO of the company. He has a long history in robotics and technology, particularly in marine environments. So, Doug, let me just pause and say we've been looking to schedule this for a while. We have loved getting to know your team. We're really pumped about what you're doing, and we feel super lucky that you're with us today. So thank you.
Yeah, Maynard, I couldn't be more honored to be here. This is an exciting podcast for me. I've been in and around the energy industry for most of my career, so I'm excited to participate, excited to tell you everything about Saronic and give my perspective on autonomy, maritime, robotics, wherever the conversation takes us.
Well, we are very excited about this, and Mike, sometimes you just get really lucky on the timing, because I was joking with Doug. Hostile marine environments with a technology overlay. Nobody's talking about that right now. So, anyway,
Yeah.
Tell us what's happening in the markets.
Well, I can sum it up in like sort of 4 words: S&P up, oil down. Back to you.
Okay. You've a new world record there, Mike.
No, but seriously, I mean, we had a bunch of stats come out today. First of all, we always like to talk about bonds and bond prices, 10 years around 4.27%. We had March PPI come out today, around a 0.5% increase, which, and it's roughly 4% year over year. And so that was well below consensus. And so bonds are pulling back today. Now, I would compare that, 4%, which everyone's all frightened and scared about, to the 11.7% peak we had in the Biden year. So nowhere close to that. We're probably going to have March PPI up again next month when we're measured. But, the question is not sort of where we are today, but where we're going. And that's going to be all predicated on what happens in the Strait of Hormuz. As far as oil, WTI today is around $92, $93, down about $6 to $7 today. It's down about $4, $4 to $5 a barrel this week since Trump announced that he was going to basically blockade the Strait of Hormuz. And so the other thing that came out today is the IEA lowered their 2026 growth forecast from roughly 650,000 barrels a day down to 80,000 barrels per day decline. So that's the first basically year over year decline we've seen since 2020. And so all I would say to that is that we really don't put a lot of faith in what the IEA says. They're consistently wrong in demand. I think they're right on the direction. The question is what is it going to look like 3 or 4 or 5 months from now? They obviously are saying that 2026 is going to be down. But on the other hand, we saw, OPEC 8 million barrels a day come out of OPEC here over the last month or so. So I think it's all going to balance out in the wash of things here. As far as oil, I think where markets are right now is markets have gone from a how high will oil prices go to how far will oil prices fall once the Strait of Hormuz issue is resolved. And I think we've been consistently saying that we don't think it's going to be 85, 90, anything like that. We think it's going to probably fall in the low 70s, mid 70s per barrel range. And that sounds terrible from where we were, but it's also fantastically above where we were. We were in the high 50s, low 60s coming into this war. I think most people expected we would stay in that range for most of 26 and maybe partially 27. So that is actually a pretty interesting environment as it relates to what's going to happen in oil services this year. I say as far as the energy market, what's interesting to me is that energy markets are now back to where they were, pre-war levels. The S&P 500 is up 1%. So you have energy down 11%, S&P is up 1%. And so essentially all that gain in energy has been taken away. So the last thing I'd say here is what we're looking at is oil service earnings are going to be really kicking in. Oil service company reporting is going to be kicking in next week. several of the big three oil services companies are going to be reporting. I think investors are going to be laser focused on what they say about not only about first half trends, but also second half of 26 and what momentum is going to look like in 2027, especially in some of these Middle East markets. And so we're really, really focused on that. And so, with that, Maynard, I think that's where the markets are right now. So we'll hand it back to you.
Okay, great. Before we jump in with Doug, Jeff, anything on your mind?
A little bit incremental to what Mike was talking about, just the market action. Just feels like all the discussions with companies, executives, folks inside of energy, outside of energy over the last few weeks. It's interesting, but it's just interesting dynamic. The closer you are to the details in and around energy, the more the trend is, the more nervous, the more dire people are worried about economic impact in Asia and the contagion here. The further away from the kind of minutia and details around energy feels like the more complacency. The optimistic spin on that would say they're just looking through what could be a pretty rough economic environment for a short period of time. But it's just an interesting dynamic. I don't know, is the market right? Are the energy nerds like in our shoes, we're sweating the details right? But it's just it's pretty stark, the contrast between if you're in the details in energy or not, how worried you are about the economic impact of all this.
It's true. I don't know. Maybe it's like you can be too close to it, but on the other hand, you can be too far from it and underestimate it.
The crazy thing, Maynard, is that the S&P 500 is 0.5% away from its all-time high. Think about that.
It's pretty crazy. Well, Doug, we sure appreciate you joining us. When we first met you, and we want to thank Toby, your general counsel, who connected us, and we've come by a couple of times in Austin. Since we've gotten to know you, you guys have built the new building. You've continued to expand, new partnerships, some really cool stuff happening. But where I was headed is, we loved you when we first met you. The environment has sure come your way in terms of the types of things people care about and want to talk about. What is it like to be at Saronic right now? I would think the phone would be ringing with questions, orders, inquiries of all kind.
Yeah. So it might be helpful here, Maynard, for me to just like baseline who Saronic is and what we do and build for the audience.
That would be awesome.
I always like to say we build both boats and ships, and I imagine folks understand the difference. But for Saronic in context, ships carry boats. Boats are much smaller. We design, manufacture, and operate autonomous surface vessels. So that's as small as our 24-foot Corsair to as large as our 180-foot Marauder. Your question is certainly on point. Business has been great for Saronic. Obviously, we've been in the news recently with raising. From a company growth perspective, it's been an absolute roller coaster. So we started just shy of 3 years ago, kind of in the late 2022, early 2023 range. It was myself, Vib, my other two co-founders, Dino and Rob, in a garage here in Austin. And then today, we're roughly 1,500 employees, mostly focused around the production and development of ASVs, but deployed assets, here domestically in the United States, all around the globe, you name it, both coasts, West Coast, East Coast. You can imagine the environment that you would put a robot in. Saronic vessels have been there. So it's been wild. It's been a joy, actually.
And Doug, I did have a chance to see the vehicle, so I don't know if I can characterize myself as dangerous. I keep saying vessels. But it seems like the technology around the boats is, pretty straightforward in terms of like the hull and the materials and the vessel itself. The complicated, fancy technology is in the software and in the AI that is driving the vessel. Those are my words. You'll say it better and correct me where I'm wrong.
Yeah. So this is an interesting perspective. I'll kind of like steer us back towards like an automotive analogy, which might be a little bit easier for people to grok. You're 1,000% correct. I think this is a circumstance in which, autonomy perception, AI, machine learning, kind of all these different technologies. And candidly, some of them are buzzwords, some of them are very real. They're growing at an exponential pace, right? I think we as people don't necessarily understand or recognize that in our day to day. And then the consequences is that something that really wasn't possible in 2021 or 2020, all of a sudden is, right? You actually have, Waymos and cruises and all these different things driving people around. You can take that same concept, you can extrapolate it out, those same technologies apply in the maritime space. And you can imagine you have the same level of performance and the same level of utility out of a Saronic autonomous surface vehicle as you and I might have driving around the streets of Austin, Texas in a Waymo. One thing that I think is worth maybe just diving into, same concept, if you're in that Waymo, where the vessel or the boat or the ship might differ, similar to what I think we'll see here in automotive and cars over the next 10 to 15 years. When you're not driving that vessel, there's no need for a steering wheel. There's no need for, a center console. There's no brakes, no gas, no windshield wipers. That same concept applies to autonomous surface vehicles, such that you would just design them very differently if it weren't you and I who were, the primary, interface point with that machine. That same philosophy is very much so true with our boats. They're designed to be robots. They're not designed to carry people, and you get a lot of advantages for that. It's pretty powerful when you kind of look at it from a compounding design, build, manufacturing point of view.
So, Doug, what, if you don't mind, it is pretty, and the company is so interesting, but it is only a few years old, and the world has changed so much since you started. What drove you guys to say now is the time to try this? And what did you see the broadness of the applications, and did you instantly sort of latch onto the military angle, or what? Just take us back a few years and tell us what you guys were thinking about.
Yeah, I'll kind of put these loosely into three categories. There's what I'll call technology enablers. So things that have happened in, call it the hard tech space that make things like, Saronic's autonomous surface vehicles possible. There's like a second bucket here, which I'll call like predictable tailwinds in the market, needs that were emerging that I think we were able to identify and understand that we could have an impact in. And then like the last one here, Maynard, is candidly just the serendipity bucket. Some things just happened to Saronic and we happened to be there at the right time. So in the first category, Vib, my other co-founder, he leads the software team here at Saronic. He and I were kind of the predominant engineering forces behind the product development. A couple big moves happened in the last, call it 3 to 7 years. One, you see a rather exponential jump in capability for small scale compute. So edge computing has grown by leaps and bounds. And even the difference in 2022 to 2026, these are exponential multipliers. These are not just 2x better, they're 10x better, and they get 10x better year over year. The second bucket here is really kind of a focus in the, call it technology zeitgeist around manufacturing and production. And Saronic is certainly, we're thought leaders here, but we're actually, we're still very much of beneficiaries of kind of titans that have come before us. But it's really an emphasis on taking some of the tried and true manufacturing processes that are happening in, more linear production lines like automotive or consumer electronics, and then re-onshoring them into kind of new and novel applications like maritime, humanoids, all of these different things. If I set that aside, those two were kind of the big movers, like, hey, this is possible. What we couldn't do in AI and ML, in 2017, we can now do in 2022. That really led us to a thesis. We took a very similar bet to kind of Tesla, where we're like, hey, we looked at the maritime environment, we looked at the various different abilities to see, hear, interact with that environment, and we made a similar choice as that organization did to really lean into vision. That vision capability was dependent on edge computing, which is dependent on all of the innovations that we're seeing around LLM, machine learning, kind of model-based training. The second bucket is like the why now. What is the opportunity that we saw in the space that we can kind of go and chase? You keyed on one. I mean, there's always been a strong pull from the U.S. DOW. That's a set of use cases that checks all the boxes. It's a dangerous environment. It's a place that you don't necessarily want people, and it's increasingly a world and an exercise that's actually driven by the economics rather than just by the capability that it was 10, 15, 20 years ago. The second bucket here was, hey, we've seen this model play out before. How do you go and develop for some of these austere, extreme use cases, and then take that technology and apply it to industry here domestically? Offshore energy is certainly one. Homeland security is another. Port and harbor security is a third. The general kind of temper and climate of the environment around critical infrastructure, securing that infrastructure, securing kind of the futures associated with that infrastructure. All of these things were very much so on our mind as we were kind of starting the business and developing products. And then the last bucket here is really the one that I don't think we could have predicted. If I look critically, we started the business, we started product development before a lot of the developments that happened in the Black Sea. Those things, while globally very unfortunate, and I wish they didn't occur, they certainly were validating the Saronic thesis, and they did kind of put a good deal of wind in our sails as a business. It's a lot came together.
So one question, did the marine environment, I was talking to a friend this morning, and I said, we're so excited, we've got Saronic coming on today. And he instantly said, oh boy, that just sounds so much better to be autonomous at sea, because if you got it wrong by 6 feet, well, you're probably not going to hit something. But on the other hand, it's a harsh environment, and there's not as much data to zoom in on to make sure you are in the right place. You have a long history in marine. Maybe just talk to us about that history and your desire to make these things happen in marine environments, including you did underwater robotics at one point.
Yeah, I guess the short answer here is masochism. I mean, this audience definitely knows that doing anything in the ocean is challenging. I'll fight the space nerds on this statement, and I'm sure the pitchforks are being brought out and the torches lit as I say this. But I think operating in the ocean and operating in that environment is actually the most challenging engineering problem to solve writ large. I think it's harder than space. I think it's harder than domestic terrestrial technology. For me personally, that's like a little bit of like a gauntlet throw from a design and technology point of view. Like, why do I want to go and settle for the second hardest environment to go and do work in when I can go and put my metal against the hardest? That's kind of the individual driver. I think from a macro scale perspective, and this is something that we can talk about, but humanity at large has been developing, building ships, boats for millennia at this point. Like, really, as soon as we saw the ocean, we thought about ways in which we can interface with it and traverse it. The upside to that is that there's this rich history, tons and tons of beautiful lessons learned that we can kind of adopt here at Saronic. The downside to it is that it's a little bit of a slower paced adoption environment. So you see technology penetrate that space at a less with less velocity than you would in our day-to-day lives, whether it's consumer electronics or something else. The consequence of it is like, I think back to some of my time offshore, there's just dozens of different ways in which that experience could have been better for me as a worker and an employer, as well as the environment that I was working with. And it just feels like something that's ripe for innovation. And I almost feel like an obligation to go and solve some of those problems.
Did you think It's interesting as you guys were developing your technologies, you, I suppose, could have chosen to simply license your, the high tech part to shipbuilders, and you didn't have to become a manufacturer. What I'm glossing over probably a ton of factors here, but you did choose to like, hey, we're going to make the whole unit, and maybe talk about that decision.
It's a key decision, and I'd say vertical integration is probably one of the pillars that we've built the business around. There's a bunch of different motivators here, right? On the socio-political scale, one of the things that we want to do at Saronic is create opportunity. We want to bring industrialization back to the maritime industry. Those are things that motivate us as a business on a very call it intrinsic level. From an economic point of view, one of the theses as we kind of looked at autonomous surface vehicles was, what winds up happening with any business that becomes an integrator of these things. When you're sitting in that seat of an integrator, you often bear both the burden and the benefit of the success or failure of that integration. And to a large extent, like we just couldn't rationalize, giving up that level of autonomy over that problem set to a stern drive failure or a shaft lock or somebody not cleaning out the seawater filter or the strainer, right? Like those are things that we didn't think were acceptable. And then when you look at it from a scale value, one of the reasons that I think autonomous surface vehicles have struggled to really see like large scale market penetration prior to Saronic was that they've always been bespoke. They've always been expensive. We know that the maritime space in general is pricey. When something has a multiplier on top of that already steep price tag, it's difficult for operators to swallow. You don't solve that without going after the whole pie, and you don't solve that without going after the production efficiencies associated with building them yourselves.
You are very much a combination of the new thing and the old thing, right? Because you're in Austin, you have all this technology, you have all this cutting edge AI and autonomous, the latest and greatest. But you have a shipyard in Louisiana. I mean, so you are really going to try to integrate a super classic industry with a super cutting edge one. What do you notice about blending those cultures and blending those teams? And you're a disruptor, so does the shipping world embrace you, or does the shipping world say, who are these guys? Or how do you think about that combination?
Yeah, I'd say, oh, this is a great question. This is I guess for background context here, Saronic acquired the yard in Louisiana about a year ago at this point. It was an area of the Gulf Coast that was seeing a relatively steep decline in business. So the yard that we acquired was in the process of laying off most of the workforce. So in some ways, it felt, I think, to that region, breathing a little bit of new life into the talent and the people who candidly are artisans and just master craftsmen who were looking for the thing to be able to pour their talent into. So on an individual level and like a direct regional level from the workforce, it's been actually phenomenal, right? And if you draw the Venn diagram of like what makes technologists tick and what makes the master craftsman, the welder, the pipe fitter tick, it's actually building something that's one used, right? Like we all want to see the things that we create actually go out into the world and derive value for other people or ourselves. And then two, built in a way that truly encapsulates like our heart's desire to make something great. And in a lot of ways, like those two philosophies married up very beautifully. And it's kind of cool. Like the software engineer here in Austin actually works wonderfully with the pipe fitter down in Louisiana. And that's a marriage I never expected to be as fruitful or loving as it's turned out to be. Industry at large, slightly different answer. shipbuilding in the Gulf Coast, shipbuilding in America in general, that's been a stressed industry for a very long time. I won't speak for Saronic's competitors in this space, but we are doing something new. New things are often scary. I can imagine that we're creating a good bit of unease amongst the folks that are building traditional ships. I'd like to think that this is a movement that kind of then matriculates out to the rest of the industry. But between now and then, I imagine it's rather frightening.
Yeah, Doug, I was interesting. It was we were at CERAWeek about 2.5 weeks ago, and a large international oil service company said something that kind of stuck with me. He said, within 10 years, we'll be having autonomous drilling done in the Gulf of America, and that kind of really struck me. And someone else that was on the panel said, we think it'll be done within 5 years. And so I'm really interested that when I hear you talking about autonomous boats and getting out there and servicing, maybe how that ties in, whether you believe that is a sort of an interesting or a doable timeline, and how does that basically factor into your strategy in sort of the Gulf of America and other areas?
Yeah, I think I'll answer the question directly, and then I'll give you the asterisk and the caveat afterwards. So I think that the capability and the technology is 1,000% on that 5-year timeline, if not sooner. Now, what I think technologists often gloss over that is, particularly poignant in the maritime world is trust and understanding of those systems is something that gets built over time. And I imagine that's on that 7-year time horizon, if not longer. So, from a Saronic perspective, one of the things that we try and do, and it's maybe a unique approach to autonomy, and maybe it's the same thing that folks are thinking about in context of autonomous drilling. Our first approach here is to build predictability into these systems. Like we want you and I, like if you are a master mariner, like you should understand like, oh, hey, that boat is going to do what I expect it to do, even if it's not necessarily like the rule book, textbook definition of what it should do in the moment. It's what the human would do in that particular scenario. That builds trust, that promotes adoption. That's the path that eventually gets you to those autonomous drill rigs. Yeah, I mean, it's coming. It's absolutely coming.
And Doug, you said something interesting, in initial questions, interactions with Maynard, just in around, when you're purpose building these vessels for autonomy, there's a number of advantage versus traditional, vessels. I wanted just to, if we could go a layer deeper in that, if you take one of your larger vessels, on the surface, that makes total sense. There's no need for quarters. I imagine there's a weight difference, but maybe just if you pick, one of the larger vessel size for similar use case, maybe just give us some examples of the things that are differently, and maybe ultimately the weight or cost delta.
Yeah, yeah. So Marauder, the 180 footer, I mean, for this industry, I think the closest analogy here is like an FSV or maybe a very small OSV. If you A/B those platforms just from like a pure, engineering, technology, geometry perspective, that Marauder has 30% more fuel than a manned vessel. The spaces that you're using for, raw water or the spaces that you're using for, black water, all of those go to diesel or, other capabilities. Same thing, like generally, when you think about when we design boats, and this was actually a little bit of a kind of a mental rewriting for some of the Navarks here on the Saronic team, a lot of the stability, shock, and vibration requirements are actually driven by you and I that are associated with those platforms. When you take some of those things away, it just opens up the trade space. You can change arrangements. You can change how you're dealing with fluid systems, engine placements, loads above deck, all of those different things. It's a multiplier. We're getting to the point, and this is, I think, as Saronic matures, you'll see this cost curve come down pretty dramatically. We're probably at parity with a manned vessel, with the delta between the advantages that you gain in build, structure, and assembly, being offset by the increase in radars, cameras, compute, technology, some of the other different things that are going into that space. As the right side of that equation becomes a little bit more commoditized, you're going to start seeing, cost value, deltas from a unmanned vessel to a manned vessel.
Doug, do you mind talking about the engine, the powertrain, and how you guys? I know you've got options as the ships and boats are bigger, but just maybe talk about the engine piece of the equation.
Yeah, so machinery control is actually still one of the hardest problems here. So on the smaller vessels, this is not that it's a solved problem here, but the surface area for issues is just significantly less. The powertrains that are on a Corsair are pretty darn robust. They're not in a circumstance where, Maynard or Doug would be crawling around in the engine room to go flip a valve, right? That's not the case on the Marauder. A lot of the software autonomy and hardware engineering work that makes that platform special is actually, removing the dependency on you and I, or that chief engineer, or that, you name it, the person who's going down into that engine room to either listen to a knocking or, deal with, flipping over from one aux tank to another, all of those different things. So we've gotten this in two different ways. One is just deep partnerships with OEMs. We have enough market traction that we have enough pull and sway and demand with, your big powertrain providers, that we participate at the engineering level with those components. We often have quite a bit more access to the underlying controls, the underlying instrumentation, everything from valve timing to, data analytics we get out of those engines that you or I might not necessarily get if we were just a consumer or an average shipbuilder on the Gulf Coast. And then it's just really a huge effort of how do you instrument these complicated mechanical systems to, offset the lack of, our intuition and our eyes and ears in such a way that you can understand when problems are arriving and you have the ability to go and address them, on voyage.
Now, the ships or the boats that I saw, they had internal combustion engines. Are all your engines going to be internal combustion, or how are you thinking about power source?
Yeah, this, I guess, call it the for the lack of a better demarcation line, I'll say 275 feet and below. Those platforms are likely to be diesel for us. We'll lean into some hybrid systems. Like, there's certainly opportunity there to kind of look at combination genset drive, electric motor drive, those kind of things. If you separate the mode of energy storage from the mode of locomotion, if you look at pure electric, I still think we're one or two technology paradigm shifts away for having the energy density to really solve that problem for commercial ships. Leisure craft, different animal. You go out on a Saturday and you're driving around 2 hours, very different than, an autonomous surface vehicle like Saronic that's going out for a 3,000-mile journey.
Mm.
Much larger than this becomes just it's really an open question. I think about this a lot, whether it's, green hydrogen, LNG, diesel, all of these different technologies. I'm kind of closely watching to see, what the Betamax, technology competition game, which way it's going to fall. A lot of that has to do with, local environmental incentives, availability of utilities at ports and harbors. Like, that's still an open question as we start designing and developing, call it 300 to 900 foot ships.
And I was wondering, as you were developing the design, were there moments where you said, do we really need to do fully autonomous, or maybe we can have, an extremely large vessel, but only 2 people instead of 40, or things like these hybrid approach, or what did you think about that question?
Yeah. So for the 180 down, and again, I feel terrible that I'm answering these questions in dualities. That has always been an unpersoned, entirely uncrewed system. We actually took a hard line on that. I think it's important that the world, one, starts recognizing the capability of that technology, and two, starts going through the muscle movements to incorporate it into day-to-day life. That's some of the advantages of selling into DOW. You get quite a few hall passes with that customer, but more importantly, we've seen this in, aerospace. The standards that are approved and accepted there build confidence in regulators and, class societies elsewhere. So that's Saronic's wedge to be able to go and get these into spaces that we can truly start uncrewing larger and larger vessels. Now, if you look in these larger vehicles, Saronic aspires to be making Panamax and Neo-Panamax size ships.
And maybe just tell us exactly how big are those kinds of ships?
Large, right? So, 600 to 1100 feet, right? Real big, vessels. Two things happen there that make the uncrewed equation slightly different. Thing one is, assuming perfect utilization, and that this is not the case. Ships tend to stay in harbor very often in their life cycle. The cost of crew compared to the capital cost of the vessel compared to the fuel and operating expense of the vessel becomes a lesser, portion of that pie. So, removing one person out of 30 becomes less of an impact when it's, something that costs you, X number of dollars per run. The second portion of this too is just the regulatory tail. So we acknowledge that IMO and ABS and USCG, they're just going to rightfully, with safety in mind, move slower, uncrewing those vessels over time. So we'll take a partially crewed approach or a dual approach in which we can, consistently remove operators off of the vessel and either onshore them remote and then eventually destined towards a totally uncrewed solution.
So, Doug, I was wondering in this, you mentioned space, the comparison to space, and the pitchfork comment. That was funny. But the connectivity that's being created by the SpaceX and others who are putting all these low Earth orbit satellites around, is that an important enabling technology for you that much coverage is happening? Do you mind talking about that?
Yeah, I should have actually put this squarely in that first of three buckets of things that moved in a really titanic way to enable, autonomous surface vehicles. It's critical. I'm excited that, certainly SpaceX's satellite constellation is the predominant one, but I'm excited to see Kuiper or some of the other competing constellations come into fruition. Competition there is good. Redundancy there is good. But it's interesting. So on one hand, it's a key enabler because it gives you a lot more insight into how these platforms are behaving. On the other hand, like the amount of information that these platforms are generating on a day-to-day basis is still exceeding those pipelines. So, you're still forced to do a lot of that compute on the edge. You still want to do all of your processing on ship. The world of, call it data centering this or, offloading it and doing that processing in the cloud still doesn't work and probably will never work. But, it gives a level of command, control, insight, visibility and trust building that we never would have gotten even 5, 6, 7 years ago.
And there's so much talk, Doug, about well, shipping in this environment. Of course, with the Strait of Hormuz has been a huge topic. The other shipping conversation that's come up of late has been the way in which some of these Arctic routes are opening up, and that's creating geopolitical tension. And I guess the third one, there's just so much activity on the seas right now. Like the ability of the U.S. Navy to be in all these places just looks really challenging. So I guess my question is, do you see the Saronic technology as really, does this mean from a defense policy standpoint, years ago we used to talk about a 600 ship Navy. Are we going to be talking about a 200 ship or 2,000 ship Navy? Like how is that how you think policy might evolve?
Yeah, I think this is already shifting in this direction. I mean, the the term that the DOW and the U.S. Navy and even our partner nations are really adopting is this concept of the hybrid fleet. I don't, I probably have a similar stance to, other technologists in context of, do these things replace people? My general answer is no. I think they actually just enable to do more. So I think you'll still see that robust, human driven Navy now augmented by, for every DDG, it's going to have a pack of 4 Marauders and 30 Corsairs. And all of a sudden its barrier and force projection is, 40, 50 miles in front of that ship, keeping people out of harm's way.
So does that mean a aircraft carrier is a less vulnerable piece of equipment with your technology because you can just spread out and protect it better?
Yeah, you can protect it better. And I think, the world today is very different. There's quite a lot of similar technology leaps and hypersonics, other different kind of, combat systems that put that aircraft carrier in danger. What this really does is it allows, the strategists of the world to poke into those dangerous places and keep those people as far as way possible from those, harmful elements without necessarily giving up, domain awareness or, mission capability or the ability to go and affect that battle space.
Do you think if, let's say Saronic was a number of more years advanced, and I say that only meaning from a scale standpoint, that you had just built more product, do you think we would be sitting here in this Strait of Hormuz situation and we would have said, well, just fill that body of water with 300 Saronic boats and we will, I'm making it up, but we would be solving this in a lot different way if we had the full Saronic fleet up and running, I'm guessing.
You're guessing. I could only guess here too, Maynard, but I think that is a very fair assumption. That Strait falls into the perfect use case for robotics, right? It's a place you and I don't want to be. It's where we don't want our sons and daughters. It's dangerous. It's congested. It's a perfect place to put a robot, and Saronic vessels could certainly help solve that situation.
Yeah, Doug, one of the things that kind of struck me is this whole culture issue. And when I think of sort of New Orleans and Louisiana, just different port towns, we're talking about industries built on captains all the way to deckhands and stuff of that nature. Maybe give us a sense or, and as you come in with an autonomous offering, maybe the cultural divide there, how you basically get everybody on the same, in the same boat essentially to say, hey, you know what, this is not going to be negative for you. This is going to be actually positive. And where the, where instead of basically the people being on the boat, where are those jobs going that, those communities can actually, benefit from that and we'll hop on board as opposed to basically stifling what you're doing.
Yeah, it's a great question. Um, Culture in general is something I think we think about very, very, very frequently. And this kind of, I guess, Mike, goes back to one of my previous statements where the message we carry and the one that we truly believe is that, that captain, maybe he's running an OSV or a PSV or something along those lines. He's not going to be doing less work, right? He's still going to be out in the field. Instead, he's going to be running with, 3 sister platforms and he's pulling 4 times the cargo with him. And there's still some level of human supervision that's happening in that operation. That's a message that's relatively well received. I recognize that it's nuanced and, we have kind of always a little bit of a fear of automation and automation removing jobs, but historically that just doesn't happen, right? Human beings just consume more. And I think that's a trend in which we're going to wind up seeing in this space. And all autonomy and autonomous surface vehicles are going to enable us to do is to do that same work much more efficiently on a much larger scale. Happy to poke at the Gulf Coast in general. I think the reluctance of that community adopting technology is maybe a little bit globally, overestimated and misunderstood. this really hasn't been a huge problem for Saronic. We've found that the welders in Louisiana are really excited, one, to become experts in autonomous systems, and then two, they love this idea of Saronic's Louisiana shipbuilder is building 4 Marauders right now, right? That's a pace that yard has never seen, and a footprint that's relatively unprecedented for that area. And it's largely because the same workforce that existed there is actually adopting these technologies to go and be force multipliers. It just means that person who's welding is an expert in inspection, an expert in tricky welds, and he's actually helping to run 4 different autonomous welders in parallel.
And maybe this kind of dovetails into this question, but you have a partnership with Hornbeck Offshore, right? Maybe the answer to the question I asked is within this partnership. I mean, what is the partnership? How have they signed on? What is the upside for them? I mean, how are they thinking about this partnership?
Yeah, I think if you were to ask the Hornbeck team, that organization has been very forward leaning, and I think their crystal ball is telling them that the world is going in this direction, and they want to be thought leaders and participants in it. So for us, it's actually a relatively natural marriage. Hornbeck understands that space. They understand the operations, the logistics, the challenges associated with doing that work. And we have some of the enabling technology to, increase their breadth and scope and work product. So that's the focus. We're, we haven't run OSVs. That's not my expertise. I don't proclaim to have that knowledge. So in a lot of ways, like we needed an industry partner that's forward thinking.
Yeah, Doug, I'd love you to talk us through kind of the adoption curve that you've experienced. On the surface, the pros are easy to see. Removing people from challenging conditions, in a challenged labor environment, all those things. On the plus side, I think easier to see. Maybe talk us through some of the inhibitors, or is it really cost of failure, or is it just time and experience observing? Maybe just talk us through those dynamics.
We're still in the bottom of that J curve of adoption. So this is actually a really relevant question. It's a couple things. In the commercial space, I think we've dealing with operators who, are coming off of, a handful of rather challenging and rather public events over the last 10, 15, 20 years. Those were very damaging from a reputation perspective. Some of them were very damaging from an environmental perspective. They were damaging from an economic perspective. So there's certainly a level of fear there. You've seen regulations change associated with tankers, bulkers, LNGs, and with regards to newer ships, like that's happened. That's reflective of that same perspective. So that's very real for Saronic, right? There's a mistrust of technology to an extent, but what it really is that the cost of failure in an offshore rig or drilling situation is just enormous for the people that are running those things, that it truly has to be a Six Sigma solution for them to actually really adopt it. So that's one. The way in which we're tackling that is really through private investment here at Saronic. We run our platforms every day. I think we just crested over 100,000 miles recently on the Corsair platform. Like at some point, you just have to put your money where your mouth is and show that these things work. And the only way that operators in maritime are going to go and recognize and respect that is like seeing them work in the ocean day to day doing jobs. So that's one. The second portion here is very much so regulatory. USCG, IMO, a lot of these different organizations are just getting their head around what autonomy means. That's still an open question. It doesn't help that the implementation of autonomy in 2026 is actually very different than what it looked like in 2020. So for an organization that releases a standard every 3-4 years, like that pace of innovation is difficult for them to keep up with. We're doing our best to be thought partners there and helping ABS in particular develop those rule sets, but it's very real. Like people get Maltese crosses and type classes to understand that they're getting a quality product. when you have something like autonomy that doesn't necessarily have those assurances, they think twice when making a purchase.
I was thinking about Doug, you mentioned your partnership offshore. You have a partnership with NVIDIA. I noticed a partnership with Palantir. Like when you think about the systems and the technologies that are required for autonomy, how many of those can you go get and integrate versus you having to develop yourself, if you follow me? There's a lot of people doing great things, but you got to make it all work. Like, how does that process work?
Yeah, so the real moat here, Maynard, is actually the data that fuels the machine. So, on one hand, the partnership with NVIDIA is obvious, right? It's around the silicon that drives a lot of our ML model training. Some, call it synthetic model generation, all that different jazz. Palantir for Saronic is a little bit more nuanced. We use some of that stack in our production environment, but all of these things, like the real valuable elements, especially in the world of like Gen AI and the ability to, kind of unlock everybody's ability to code. The real advantage is that the 100,000 miles of time underneath the keel for Corsair. It's the work that we've done, with bathymetrics that allows us to go and understand, how this channel is evolving over time. Those are the things that really enable the flywheel. And the cool thing here, and this is really one of Vib and I's original thesis is that if data is the moat, the best way to get data is to make a whole bunch of things. So if you become incredibly powerful and incredibly strong in this context of manufacturing and production, the data falls in, and that just becomes like a rapidly growing business flywheel that allows you to accelerate into perpetuity.
Hmm. There is this fascinating sort of cultural thing going on, Doug. We bump into it. We don't want to exaggerate it, but it seems like this. I don't know. In tech land, software was king, and the hardware was like, you know, you can use. You had a number of choices, or it was almost commoditized. But now we've moved into this period where the blending of the two, and in fact, taking the hardware into the physical world, like this has become the new super cool thing, and people don't want to be just software. I'm way out of my league, Doug, because I'm talking about the tech world. But is this remotely true? Like, how would you characterize what's happening here?
I think it's absolutely true. Yeah. I mean, I feel like I live that statement in a day to day. Um, there's there's a lot going on. There's a lot to unpack here, Maynard.
I did this. Yeah, this is like a psychological question about a gazillion people, but
Yeah. So I think a couple things are happening. I mean, culturally, both with kind of younger generations and candidly even my generation, I think you're seeing like a return to the tactile. Like I think as humans in general, like we either through the rise of social media, the internet, all of these different things, I think collectively, again, this is Doug's opinion, certainly not a fact. I'm definitely not a psychologist or a sociologist here, so please take this with a massive grain of salt. But I think we're all gravitating back to something that is tangible, right? People buy records again, right? It's the same driving force that makes that purchase decision that is kind of driving people towards building hardware. And then honestly, like the hard truth here is that the ability to create software is becoming significantly more democratized, right? It's easier to do today than it was a decade ago. And not that it's not a skill set that's valuable and drivable, but we're dealing with the corner cases of reality that people want to go and solve, and those become the interesting problems.
do you think part of it is, I mean, there's so many forces at work, Doug, but I'm just thinking, like you're in Austin, and Austin is, it's a tech capital, but it's the tech center of a state, which is a very physical,
Yeah.
mechanical. So like, it's almost like we have, as people have left Silicon Valley, they have been blending into more mechanical environments, and that's why we're getting these blended approaches to some stuff. I don't know. I'm not a psychologist either, or a moving expert.
I think that's real. I mean, we have a presence in Galveston, so we're kind of outside of that major manufacturing hub. Same thing, obviously, in Louisiana. If you look at Austin proper, sure, there's tech here, but that tech is in the Gigafactory. It's in the Samsung factory. Your point's valid. I mean, the people of Texas have always had a little bit of oil and dirt underneath their fingernails, and I think it's just very real.
So I think this is one thing we've wondered about is, bringing Houston and Austin closer, and you're a business model that is doing that, so to speak. Like, do you have observations on how we keep accelerating the merger of the tech and the mechanical worlds?
That's a good question. I think the remaining barriers are like very visceral. Like we've seen this in our shipyard. Some of the reasons in which someone doesn't want to be in a shipyard, and I imagine this goes for someone out, on a rig or in the patch or somewhere along those lines, is like the environment is just unpleasant, right? So if you can help solve for that and remove some of the friction that is associated with, interacting with that space and being in that space, it very, very much so help. We've seen that in the Louisiana yard, right? We air condition our build spaces. That's been a huge value add for that workforce. All of a sudden, it's not necessarily, less attractive to be making, building, shaping, in Franklin as it is, compared to, sitting over in, I don't know, like Atlanta doing some sort of, general desk-based job. So that's helpful. That's something I think that's worth just the industry at large recognizing and kind of leaning into. That comes obviously at the expense of the bottom line, but I think the thesis there is that it grows the top line in a way that's powerful.
You've had so much experience around robotics. What we're struck by, there's all these enabling technologies colliding that you've listed, but at the same time, there's this other just person power problem. It's just hard to find the people to do the jobs, and so is that must be something you feel quite directly about. Just it's just hard to find labor.
Yeah, yeah. There's a gap here. And it's like a pretty, I think, closely correlated gap with, a general nationalistic movement away from the trades and some of the other things that are associated with that. We're seeing it, we feel it. We've been fortunate enough, at least in Louisiana, that there's enough of a wow factor and a little bit of a sparkle and jazz to the work that we're doing in that region that, at least to date, we've been able to manage that problem. That being said, I certainly look at, this on 3, 5, 7, 10, 15, 20-year horizons. And at some point, that luster will wear off. And at some point, we are going to have, some level of, artisan skilled labor shortages. I don't have a great answer to it. We're probably going to wind up diversifying some of our manufacturing operations to at least tap into different pots of that across the nation. But it's real. We're leaning into, your local trade schools, your universities. We're personally driving wages up for those various different kind of skilled jobs. Like these are the things that move the needle, but they don't move the needle next week. They move the needle on like the order of years. So it's real. It's very real.
Well, it's a topic that a number of people are talking about and paying attention to. Maybe that's something it's something we'd like to be more involved in. We know you can't solve it right away, as you say, either, but we got to do it.
This is, this is another can of worms to unpack, but the general manning challenge associated with, U.S. flagged vessels is very, very, very real. That is a place in which, autonomy can help. right? That's a short-term needle mover that could potentially really change the cost economics of doing maritime work here near or onshore in America.
So, Doug, that is a can of worms. So basically, you said the Jones Act. Are you saying you can take an unmanned vehicle? What unpack that one just a hair more because that was a big one.
Yeah, yeah. So this is, I think we understand this, that if you look across, globally, most of whether it be logistics ships, shipping and logistics, less so with what I'll call like high tech, various purpose-built vessels, like those tend to be a little bit of a different category. But for the mundane and the generic, most of those things are, staffed with international staff. It's a lot of the reason in which why they're not flagged, US domestically. Cost of labor here, a Chang and a captain are quite expensive. Those things
Yeah,
are real drivers to be able to do
I
work
got you.
for sure.
I got you. Yes. Okay. Fair point.
And there's
Well,
a
Doug,
shortage, right? So
this has been awesome. I don't
yeah,
know what topic we didn't cover, so God bless you. We did the psychology of the tech sector to the Strait of Hormuz and a Louisiana shipyard somewhere along the way. So
I,
thank you.
I love this, Maynard. I really enjoy talking about this stuff. I mean, you're kind of asking like the Kool-Aid man if he likes red Kool-Aid. So I'm happy to be here. I'm always happy to chat, happy to give a perspective. I'm very grateful for your time today.
Well, come on down. We'll make some more Kool-Aid and we'll drink it together, Doug. This was a lot of fun.
Right on.
Thank you, everybody.